The desert stretched to the horizon in waves of red and gold. The sun so bright it seemed to burn the shadows out of the earth. Cole Turner had been riding for 3 days, moving cattle through Apache territory, keeping to the low ground, watching the ridges for any sign of trouble. He was a man who had learned to be careful, to read the land, to trust his gut when something felt wrong. And something felt wrong now. The air was too still, the animals too quiet, and somewhere in the distance, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Thunder in a cloudless sky. He crested a ridge and saw a wall of dust rising from the valley floor, a dark tide that rolled across the desert with a sound like the world ending. Buffalo, hundreds of them, thousands, running wild, their hooves shaking the earth, their eyes wild with a fear that had turned them into a killing machine. And in the middle of the valley, directly in their path, a figure on a horse, a woman, her hair streaming behind her, her horse bolting, her arms flailing as she tried to stay on. Cole did not think. He kicked his horse into a gallop and rode straight into the storm. The sound of the stampede was deafening, a roar that filled his ears, his chest, his bones. Dust choked his lungs, blinded his eyes, but he kept his horse moving, weaving through the beasts, looking for the woman who had disappeared into the chaos. He saw her horse fall, saw her thrown to the ground, saw her curl into a ball as the wall of hooves bore down on her. He leaned low over his horse, reached down, caught her arm, and pulled her up behind him with a strength he did not know he had. The buffalo parted around them like water around a stone, and he rode for the ridge, for the light, for the life that was still his to save. He did not stop until the valley was behind him, until the dust had settled, until the thunder of hooves faded to a distant rumble. He dismounted, his legs shaking, his hands trembling, and lifted the woman from his horse. She was small, lighter than he expected, her face streaked with dust and blood, her eyes closed. For a moment, he thought she was dead. Then she coughed, opened her eyes, and looked at him with a gaze that seemed to see straight through him. She spoke in Apache, words he did not understand, but he did not need to understand. She was alive. That was enough. He gave her water, cleaned the cut on her forehead, wrapped her in his coat. She watched him with eyes that were dark and deep, eyes that held a calm he had not expected. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, and this time he understood some of it. "My father," she said. "He will come." Cole looked around at the desert, at the ridges that seemed to watch them, at the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of his vision. He had heard the stories. The Apache chief who ruled this territory, a man who had fought the army, the settlers, anyone who tried to take his land, a man whose daughter he had just saved. "Good," he said. "He should know you're safe." They came at sunset, a line of riders on the ridge, silhouetted against the burning sky. Cole counted a dozen at first, then 20, then more than he could count. They rode down the slope in silence, their horses moving with a grace that seemed to belong to the land itself. At their head was a man, old but unbent, his face carved by years and weather, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He dismounted, walked to his daughter, took her face in his hands. She spoke to him in their language, her voice low, and he listened without moving. When she finished, he turned to Cole, and for a long moment, he simply looked at him. "You saved my daughter." The chief's voice was deep, resonant, the voice of a man who had spent his life commanding. Cole nodded, his hands steady at his sides. "I did what any man would do." The chief's eyes narrowed. Any man would run from a stampede. Any man would watch from the ridge. You rode into it. You did not know who she was. You did not know what you would get. You saved her because it was right. He stepped closer, and Cole felt the weight of his gaze, the weight of a man who had buried enemies and friends and sons, who had learned to see truth in the faces of men. "What is your name?" "Cole Turner." The chief nodded slowly, as if testing the name, finding it good. "I am Nako. This is my land, my people, my daughter who owes you her life." He placed his hand on Cole's shoulder, and the gesture was not threatening. It was something else. Something Cole had never received from a man like this. Respect. You will come to my camp. You will eat with us. You will be honored. Cole looked at the warriors on the ridge, at the daughter who was watching him with eyes that held something he could not name, at the chief who was offering him something no white man had ever been offered. I would be honored, he said. The camp was hidden in a canyon that Cole had ridden past a dozen times without seeing. Tents of hide and canvas, fires that burned low, children who watched him with wide eyes and women who looked at him with suspicion. But Nako led him to the center, to a fire that burned brighter than the others, and seated him beside the chief himself. They fed him meat and corn and something that tasted of honey, and they asked him no questions. They simply watched him, measured him, waited to see what kind of man he was. Her name was Talila, the daughter he had saved. She sat across the fire from him, her face lit by the flames, her eyes never leaving his. The days that followed were unlike anything Cole had experienced. He stayed in the camp at Nako's invitation, and slowly, the suspicion of the people turned to acceptance. He learned their ways, their language, the stories they told around the fire. He worked alongside the warriors, hunted with them, learned to move through the desert with a silence he had never thought possible. And always, Talila was there watching him, teaching him, laughing at his mistakes with a sound that made his chest ache. He had not come looking for this. He had not come looking for anything. But something was growing between them that he could not name and could not stop. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, he found her at the edge of the canyon, looking out at the desert. She did not turn when he approached, but she did not move away. "You saved my life," she said, and her voice was soft, thoughtful. "I have not thanked you properly." He stood beside her, close enough to see the way the light caught in her hair, the way her hands rested on the rock. "You don't need to thank me." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his breath catch. "My father has offered you a place among us. You have not accepted." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I belong here." She smiled then, a small, sad smile that made him want to know what she was thinking. "You belong wherever you choose to be. That is the difference between you and my people. We are tied to this land, to this canyon, to the bones of our ancestors. You are free." He looked out at the desert, at the vast emptiness that had always been his home, and for the first time, it felt empty. "I have been free my whole life," he said. "I never knew how lonely it was." She reached out, touched his hand, and the contact sent a shock through him. "You are not alone now," she said, and she walked back to the camp, leaving him standing at the edge of the canyon, watching the stars appear, wondering what it would be like to stay. The attack came at dawn. Raiders from a rival tribe, warriors who had tracked the camp for days, who saw Nako's people as weak, vulnerable, easy. Cole woke to the sound of war cries, the clash of weapons, the screams of women and children. He grabbed his rifle, ran into the chaos, and found himself fighting beside men who had been strangers a week ago. He fought like a man possessed, his rifle singing, his fist bloody, his body a wall between the raiders and the people who had become something he had not expected. Family. When it was over, he found Talila standing in the smoke, her face streaked with blood that was not her own, a knife in her hand, her eyes fierce. She had fought too. She had protected her people, and when she looked at him, she smiled. The warriors carried the wounded to the fires, counted the dead, mourned those they had lost. Nako stood at the center of the camp, his face gray with grief, his hands steady on his rifle. He had lost sons in the attack, nephews, men who had fought beside him for years, but he had not lost his daughter. He called Cole to him, and the camp went silent. "You fought beside us," Nako said, and his voice carried across the canyon. "You did not have to. You could have run. You could have saved yourself. But you fought. You bled. You protected my daughter, my people, as if they were your own." Cole stood before him, his shirt torn, his hands still bloody, his heart pounding. "They are my people," he said. And he meant it. Nako was silent for a long time, and the camp was silent with him. Then he stepped forward, placed his hands on Cole's shoulders, and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. "You saved my daughter from the stampede. You fought beside my warriors against our enemies. You have shown courage, honor, a heart that beats for my people." He looked out at the camp, at the faces that were watching, waiting. "1,000 warriors are yours. I give you command. I give you my trust. I give you." He paused, and his eyes went to Talula, who stood at the edge of the fire, her face lit by the flames. "I give you my daughter, if she will have you." The camp erupted. Warriors shouted, women wept, children danced around the fire. Cole stood in the center of it, stunned, his heart pounding, his eyes finding Talila across the flames. She was smiling, but there were tears on her face, and she was walking toward him, and the world seemed to narrow to her face, her eyes, her hands reaching for his. "1,000 warriors," she said, and her voice was low, meant only for him. "That is a great honor." He took her hands, pulled her closer, and for a moment, he forgot that anyone else was there. "I don't want 1,000 warriors," he said. "I only want you." She laughed, and the sound was like water in the desert, and he kissed her there, in front of her father, her people, the stars that were coming out one by one. They were married in the spring, when the desert bloomed with flowers that had been waiting for rain, when the canyons were green and the air was soft. The ceremony lasted 3 days, with dancing and singing and feasting that brought people from across the territory. Cole stood beside Talila, her hand in his, and watched the sun set over the canyon that had become his home. Nako sat at the fire, his face lined but peaceful, and when he looked at his daughter and the man who had saved her, something in his chest eased. He had given Cole 1,000 warriors. But what Cole had given him was worth more than any army. He had given him peace. The years that followed were not easy. There were more raids, more enemies, more days when the camp woke to the sound of war cries. But Cole fought beside his new people, led them with a courage that had been born in the stampede and hardened in the battles that followed. He became a legend among the Apache, a man who had been given 1,000 warriors and had earned them 100 times over. But the legend was not what mattered to him. What mattered was the woman who slept beside him, the children who called him father, the people who had taken him in when he had nothing and given him everything. He turned to her, took her face in his hands, and looked at her the way he had looked at her across the fire that first night, with wonder, with gratitude, with a love that had grown from a single moment of courage into something that would last a lifetime. "Your father offered me 1,000 warriors," he said. "He offered me command, honor, a place among his people. But the only thing I ever wanted was you." She reached up, touched his face, traced the lines that time had carved there. "You saved me," she said. "And then you saved all of us." He kissed her then, there at the edge of the canyon, with the desert spread out before them like a sea of light. And when he pulled back, her eyes were bright. "We saved each other," he said. And in the canyon below, the fires of the camp glowed warm and gold, and the people who had become his family slept in peace, knowing that the man who had ridden into a stampede and saved the chief's daughter had become something none of them had expected. He had become one of them. He had become home. And somewhere in the desert, the buffalo still ran, the wind still whispered, and the legend of the cowboy who was given 1,000 warriors grew with each telling. But Cole knew the truth. He had never wanted an army. He had wanted a place to belong. And he had found it in the canyon, in the firelight, in the eyes of a woman who had looked at him across the flames and seen a man worth waiting for.